To our webinar about In the Mind of a Dyslexic Child. And we're really excited to be talking to you today. And we thought, first of all, we'd just introduce you to who we all are. So we've got Roger Broadbent, and Roger is from the Dyslexia Institute UK. He's very, very experienced. I'm sure you've heard him talk at other things, very experienced about the world of dyslexia and other parts of dyslexia that we'll touch on today. And we're really lucky that we have him today as our expert. We also here we've got Joe and Kathleen and myself, Rosie. We work for Hackney Education, which is Hackney Local Education Authority. We work predominantly in the world of reading, both all the way from early reading up to Key Stage 3 reading. And a lot of our work involves working with children in mainstream classrooms around reading, and a huge range of children as well. So we're really excited to talk through what we're going to be doing today. So just to let you know how this webinar will work, we've got a Slido, which hopefully you've had access to, so you can ask questions on that. We've looked at some questions that were submitted before, and we're really discussing what it would be like for some of our children with dyslexia in the classroom, drawing on our experiences. We're all teachers, and also drawing on Roger's expertise as well. We're going to talk about through some suggestions, hopefully in the questions that you answered, but just to say it's a broad and complex subject, which once I think we got talking, we realised to Roger how broad and complex it is. We won't have time to cover everything, but hopefully we've got some resources to share with you that we think will help, and we'll try and follow up any unanswered questions where possible through the Slido or at a later date as well. So welcome to everyone, and a huge welcome to Roger. We're going to start and put Roger on the spot first of all. So one of the questions that came through, and I think one of the things when we first talked together, Roger, was just about actually, when we're talking about dyslexia, what is dyslexia? What do we mean by dyslexia? And sort of what should we know about dyslexia in terms of children in an education as well? Oh, Roger, you're on mute.
Thanks very much. Before I start, I want to give a massive thumbs up and thank you to Hackney Borough Council, specifically Hackney Literary Support Team, Rosie, Joe, Kathleen, Joanne, Simon and Mario. As a dyslexic person, wouldn't it be fantastic if every local authority were so committed to supporting dyslexia for the population, for their local population, and with the literacy support team throughout the country? They work with over 300 schools. Amazing. So big thumbs up from me and a big thank you. Okay, so dyslexia in the mind of a dyslexic child. It's a really complex issue, dyslexia, and we need to have a really thoughtful, structured approach as to how we can best support individuals with dyslexia, especially in these times that we're all going through, of these austerity times that we're going through at the minute. The causes of dyslexia, in general, it's 80% due to DNA, so it's a hereditary condition. The other 20% being caused by a range of things like head trauma, stroke, fetal abuse, these types of things. And when we're talking about dyslexia, we've got to bear in mind there are different types of dyslexia. So there's the one that we know, which is the issues around words and writing and spelling, those types of things. But we've got dyscalculia for maths, dysgraphia for skeletal control. Sorry, dysgraphia is the way that we hold a pen, and then dyspraxia for skeletal control. It affects 20% of the population. So it's a large number of people. Here in the UK, we're talking of about 14 million people. It's a lifelong condition. It doesn't go away. We can improve on the things that it impacts on us in a more difficult way, more challenging way. We can improve on some of those, but it's not something that we can just press a button and it's gone. The underlying consequences for the dyslexic child in the classroom mainly is around short concentration span, circa 10 minutes, which is quite difficult when an average class size is about 40-50 minutes. Poor organisational skills and weaker working memory. So that's more challenging for the teachers to try and work that information into long-term memory so that it's more accessible and they can use it, especially at exam times. The information processing difficulty of the brain, mainly is because the wiring of the brain that we dyslexics will process information through the right-hand side, the right hemisphere of the brain, as opposed to the left hemisphere of the brain, which makes it more difficult and more challenging. So that's kind of where we're at. Okay.
Fantastic, Roger.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to do the next question. Is that okay? We
Yeah.
talked a lot about the sort of leadership, school leadership, and the effect that can make on dyslexic children. And I suppose just thinking really about the benefits of having a strong approach for dyslexic children, what sort of benefits there are. Is that all right to answer that one, Roger? Yeah.
Yeah, I think we've said how complex the dyslexic condition is. What I think we need to really bear in mind is that when we're looking to address dyslexia, we can't just rely on one dyslexia knowledgeable teacher to take on that challenge. We can't rely on a teaching assistant to be able to do it. We can't rely on a SENCO. It has to be a whole range of interventions and support throughout the school. So that's from the head teacher to the maintenance person. We need everybody to be reminded of what dyslexia is and how to try and support individuals who might be struggling with dyslexia from time to time. So we need dyslexic pupils to feel that their difference, their uniqueness, is being listened to and understood. So we're not alienating young learners from an early age, because as soon as we start to do that, then young people fall out of love with school, and then we get all the behavioural problems that then start to develop if we're not careful.
Okay.
We need to try and encourage young dyslexic learners to take ownership of their dyslexia. And by that, I mean that we need them to start thinking about what their dyslexia means to them and what are the challenges that brings for them as individuals, because everybody's different, and what they can start to do to address that moving forward. So it might be that they're forgetful with school kit and taking school books into school or doing homeworks. Well, we've got to try and help them to develop a way of remembering the key important stuff for school.
Yeah, lovely. Okay.
Yeah, and the benefit to the school is going to be that the performance is going to improve. Academic performance, the overall attitude and behaviour is going to be more positive. Teachers are going to be less stressed in the classrooms, having to deal with problem kids. NQTs, newly qualified teachers, are going to be better able to support dyslexics in the classroom, and again, better behaviour. And also the big thing is Ofsted are going to be a lot happier with the way that school addresses the dyslexic pupils.
Lovely, thank you, Roger. Yeah, brilliant. And I think a follow-up question to that was, how can we support all staff to create an inclusive school? Rosie, I don't know whether you had wanted to come in there at all. I know one of the things we talked about quite a bit was flexibility for those pupils, but if you want to come in.
Yeah, I think Roger, I think one of the things that you said is about sort of the traits and the complexities around the differences in how children learn with dyslexia. And I think one of the things that I would always say first when you're building an inclusive school is really getting everyone to understand that. And by everyone, it's not just your SENCO holding that information, it's disseminated across all your staff as well. So I think that kind of whole school approach and understanding what it is, and then also thinking about the small things you can do or how you can share resources. And I think sometimes when we talk about staff CPD, it can be really overwhelming. There's lots of things that in a school you're doing every day. And I guess it's the same when you go into employment. Like, actually, there's loads of different changes that could be made, but there might be one small thing that can be made and acted on that would support that all the children with dyslexia in your classroom as well. And I think that's one of the really important things. And Roger, I love what you said about the benefits of it being sort of, one, it's academic success, but also it's that positivity that children will feel for themselves, and also for teachers. If everyone understands what it means to be a dyslexic child in the classroom and how the school can support them. And actually that also means that you'll have happier, more confident teachers in dealing with that. Hopefully incidents of behavior problems will go down, and it will just be that much more inclusive and targeted support for all children with dyslexia as well. And I know, Roger, actually one of the things we talked about was thinking about your staff as well. We often forget, when you talked to that statistic right at the beginning, which I scribbled down, about how many people will have some form of dyslexia or dyscalculia or dyspraxia or dysgraphia in the population. Actually, if you think about staffing in school, the likelihood is that one of your members of staff would have dyslexia as well. So that whole school approach, and the parents and carers that are in your school, that whole school approach isn't just about the children, it's about everyone in your community. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add, Roger or Kathleen?
Yeah.
Some excellent points there, Rosie. I would like to go back to the Ofsted point that I alluded to. The Send Green Paper that's going through government at the moment. Ofsted are really keen on us as the education populace. They want to try and encourage schools to be more effective in supporting children with special needs and dyslexics. And they want to see teachers demonstrating how they're assessing those individual pupils, how they're demonstrating how they are progressing, how the teacher knows that they're progressing. And they also want teachers to be able to demonstrate what the pupils are struggling with. So there was we had a presentation at the conference at University of Salford, SEND conference, where Adam Sproston, a senior Ofsted inspector, wants to see dyslexic children demonstrating knowledge and understanding of their learning using alternative ways. And I thought this was really interesting. So this could really fit in with a dyslexic's approach to learning. So you could use a video presentation made by the dyslexic person or group of individuals, or they could make a poster, or to have a one-to-one explanation about what they've learned, or they could produce a mind map demonstrating what they've learned. So it doesn't just have to be in an essay format, something that's going to be reflective of the dyslexic individual. He also alluded to there being clear steps for that young person as to how they're going to progress into the next phase, because he highlighted that education has been not as good as it could be in transition phases from primary to secondary to college or apprenticeship or to university, because those are the phases where these individuals, young dyslexic learners, are particularly vulnerable, and we need to try and help those individuals be minded of what's coming next. So, for example, a primary school pupil, let's make sure that they've visited the secondary school before they go and they know it well. They've had a good look round, they might maybe had a lunch there, they maybe met the teacher who's going to be their form teacher, and they feel more comfortable when they make that step across. Also, he highlighted, which supports Rosie's view to being as effective as we can be supporting dyslexic young people, is to try and get the families involved. And this is what Ofsted want to see from as early as possible, so that it's this joined up writing, this holistic approach that we can have to supporting the young person. Thanks, Kathleen.
Yeah, and I just want to, so many good points there. I just wanted to add a little bit about just flexibility, because I think sometimes that's a real barrier to dyslexic learners. We have a huge curriculum to get through. We have so many different things that we want to include, and sometimes it's about being flexible in that model in terms of what those children are expected to do. And I think that really supports sort of thinking through what the barriers are for those children in that case. Brilliant. Next question, should we do, Rosie?
Yeah, I just to pick up on what Roger said as well. I love the fact you said about the ways that we can record learning. And I think when we're talking about creating a whole school ethos, it's being like you said, being creative about the ways we capture learning from children and how we use that in there. And I think that leads really nicely into kind of the classroom setting. We talked a little bit about the whole school, about those systems, but just in the classroom setting, and I think Kathleen and Joe, you're going to come in on this, but how do we manage to support children with dyslexia? What would be our top tips, and what can we do to support children who either have a diagnosis of dyslexia, which I know Jo will come on to, or even those children that actually we suspect could have some kind of difference around their learning, which could be due to dyslexia? Kathleen, if there are any things that you can expand on?
I think we've talked about it. I've just seen a question in Slido about self-esteem in children, and it's all about being supportive, taking away those barriers and building in success wherever possible. So sort of there's an awful lot on the fact sheet that we're going to send out, but 3 main ideas from that: orientating children by recapping, putting into context the learning, not starting cold, warming the children up so to remember, so they can remember what information they already know. I think all our reading approaches that we all lead on really focus on that in terms of making sure children always keep that big picture in mind, whether it's the text, the book, etc. The other thing is clarity and simplicity and how important that is, whether it's a sequence, whether it's the way you present information on a flip chart or on a written worksheet or something like that. And just that importance of that clear modelling, that's sequencing, that really important structure to the lesson, I think is vital. And I think the other part is just really making sure children are as active as they can be in lessons. Talk, which is central, I know, to DSR, DR and the LIT programme, is so important in terms of those children who might be slower in terms of processing, just giving them that opportunity to think at a much deeper level and think through what they want to say in terms of their oracy, and just that whole multisensory learning. I know we do quite a lot of work about vocabulary and how important that is, and in terms of comprehension as well. So all of those strategies, I think, really support independence. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add at all, Rosie, in terms of teaching, or Jo in terms of assessment maybe as well?
Yeah, well, I just think a lot of things you've spoken about there are just good practice, aren't they? Things that will work for all pupils. I think sometimes, we forget sometimes that just what we do for pupils with a learning difference will help all our pupils, such as things as like breaking instructions down, visuals. And Roger's, the point Roger made about recording pupils' responses in different ways. Again, that's a great strategy you can use for lots of pupils, if not all. But yeah, thinking about your dyslexic pupils, if they have a diagnosis, if you have a report for, an assessment report, the importance of looking at that and seeing what's suggested in there as that pupil's strengths and weaknesses, talking about self-esteem and improving their self-esteem. Find out from your pupil, from that report, but also talking to your pupils, your dyslexic pupils, what is it that helps them? How do they like to learn? What doesn't help them? But if you do have a report, yeah, definitely look in there, because they may, if your school's lucky enough and your pupil's lucky enough to have a separate specialist teacher for that pupil who is using that report to design a teaching program, check in with that teacher, and because you want to be able to use similar strategies in the classroom, you don't want to be confusing things. So for example, if the specialist teacher has picked up on certain words or vocabulary or spellings that pupil they're focusing on with that pupil, you don't want to then be in class adding extra spellings or extra different strategies for that dyslexic pupil. Well, what I would say is, if you don't have a diagnosis, if you have a pupil that you strongly believe is dyslexic or has a learning difference and struggling with their literacy, you can use the same strategies for that pupil. You don't have to wait to get a diagnosis. If you really think they're struggling, again, try and find out from their pupil what their strengths and weaknesses are. You can do assessments, you can check in with your SENCO on what assessments you can do to find out strengths and weaknesses, for example, with phonic knowledge or, but beyond that, just talking to your pupil, listening to them read. Now, how are they reading? What interests, building on their strengths. So just sort of informal assessments as well. And yeah, I think really just talking to the pupil, I think that can go a long way. You recognising their difficulties and recognising their strengths, talking to them about what their interests are and how you can build that into lessons, can go a long way for building that pupil's self-esteem. And I think that leads into, Roger, we've mentioned your empowerment passport that really gives pupils with learning differences a voice, a way to express their strengths and weaknesses. Just thinking, drawing on that, is there any advice you can give us on how to talk to a dyslexic pupil about their learning, and what would you ask them, about their learning needs?
Yeah, thanks, Joanne. Some excellent points made by the team from Hackney Lit. Things like recapping, brilliant. Warming up the child's knowledge about a subject before you dive into it, being clear about the instructions, talking to the child about their strengths and weaknesses. I think it's also kind of get them to build up their own self-confidence about what they can do, but also not to be scared of revealing to you what they're not that great at, you know, and not to be try and pop the bubble of the fear around the education experience, because that can really hinder a dyslexic young person from getting involved in the classroom. And yeah, going on to the Empowerment Passport, I must come clean, everybody, I'm a director of the Empowerment Passport. We've been working on it for years. And what it is, okay, so it's electronic, it's person-centered, so it supports people with neurodiversity, mental health issues, physical handicap, and long-term health issues. And the main thrust of it is because it's from the lived experience. I'm dyslexic. I fell up. One of the directors is dyslexic. I've got a very autistic son. What it is to try and encourage the user, the owner of the Empowerment Passport, even though it's paid for by the school, it's the individual who owns it and they fill it in. It's to help them, to encourage them to get a better understanding of what their condition is and to get ownership of that condition. And we want that to happen as early as possible so that they can then develop a mature approach, a mature attitude to dealing with it. Because at the minute, we're not doing that. And we know that far too young people are getting a diagnosis of dyslexia anyway. So we want people to be able to explain what difficulties they're having, what issues that they're having, what works for them, what doesn't work for them. It's ideal when supporting a student through transition phases, whether that's from primary to secondary or university into employment. They make an education plan in conjunction with their support worker or teacher or SENCO. And if they go into employment, they make an employment plan, and it's the same. What they need to be in place to help them be successful in that situation, whether it's in education or in the workplace. And that's pretty much it in a nutshell. But we're finding the response from a range of students, a range of ages across the education sphere, from universities to colleges to schools. We're finding it to be very well received by the user themselves because it's theirs and they feel empowered by using it. Thank you.
I really like what you said there, Roger, and I've just somebody in the Slido's put what's the passport, so hopefully that's explained it a bit more. But I think one of the things when I looked at it, which I really think, and I think we're talking like we've got lots of questions about how do you get a diagnosis, but we've also had some questions about what do you do if you suspect a child could have dyslexia, but you don't have that diagnosis, or you don't know the pathways to go, or there's not the support in school. I mean, that's a kind of whole issue. But I think some of the questions in your Empowerment Passport and really working with the young person in your class or who you're supporting, understand what their strengths are, where their difficulties lie, and then what works best for them. And we had a brief conversation about exam prep earlier before we came on around sort of mind mapping, and we were saying as well, actually sometimes we tell children, oh, use a mind map, but do we ever model what that actually looks? But I think children really understanding those can really impact. Somebody's put about self-esteem, and going back to that point, like Joe, you always say self-esteem is one of the biggest things around children with learning differences, that actually we need to build up their self-esteem. If they're able to talk about their strengths and talk about their difficulties, and it's a very supportive and reflective classroom for any child, that's going to support them in their learning. If we all look back on our education, there are things that we were good at. I was terrible at cross country, and I didn't like it, but actually I never felt good about it. Maybe if I'd known about that, but there was something else I could do, that would have helped me to sort of just feel stronger and more confident as we go through. So I really like what you said there as well.
Rosie, can I just give a specific example of that? I mean, I think there are two things that dyslexic children often talk about. One, writing down the learning intention and it taking ages, and the other one is written comprehension and never getting to the end. And I think two things there: written comprehension, pick the 5 questions they need to do so they feel a sense of accomplishment they've finished, underline the one or two words of the learning intention that they'll write down as their heading. Simple ways that children can feel much more inclusive and much more like they're achieving, which I think is really important. We also had a question about...
Sorry, Kathleen, you set me off because you just said
cool.
that. And I'm just going to quickly jump in, because I think also it's about what's the necessary there. Actually, with a learning intention, what's the necessary for the child writing it down? Or is it the most important thing is they understand what that learning intention is and how they can deal with it? And I think sometimes we kind of get into a system where we have to do that. But actually, if for that child, it's about them being able to articulate the learning intention and that's marked in their book, or the point of a learning intention is I know what I'm learning and I know how I can be good at it. And also, sorry, I'm just going to say one last thing. I think with reading comprehension as well, I think one of the things that, especially if you haven't struggled at school and in certain things, if you can do a written comprehension or you answer those questions, sometimes what you don't understand is all the difficulties that come in that. And one of the hardest things I think we ask, and Kathleen's heard me say this about 10 billion times, is in reading comprehensions, what we're asking a child to do is to read something and understand it. We're asking them to read the questions and understand the questions. We're asking them to go back to the text, locate the answers. Then we're asking them to write them down in a succinct way as well. And if you think of that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps they've got to do to get to that answer, for some children, unless you've broken it down into pieces that are easily manageable, that's really overwhelming. So I think, so I just wanted to say that, Kathleen. I'll let you go on. That's it.
No, that's fine. That's brilliant. And I think that's why I know in Desert Reader we do a lot on that, don't we? Okay, do you want to talk about parents quickly? We've mentioned that before, but I think we talked a little bit of just the importance about how we communicate to parents. Do we consult them on that? Do we adapt homework where necessary? How do we make sure we're being positive and they're hearing positive things? I don't know if you wanted to add any more on that, Roger, at all about parents. You've said quite a lot already, but...
Yeah, I'd love to, Kathleen. I'm loving what I'm hearing in today's webinar. I think it's really positive. This building up the self-esteem and self-confidence of the young person, really important. I think it's equally important to engage with the parents or carers of the young dyslexic person. We've got to remember that there's a strong likelihood that those individuals are going to be dyslexic themselves and may well have had a negative educational experience and may not come to parents' evenings, who may not engage well with the school. We need them to be on board. We need them to be helping with this overall holistic collaborative approach to supporting that young dyslexic person through their education experience so they can be as successful as possible. And it's tricky to reach out to parents. Everybody's busy these days, we're under lots of different pressures, workload, etc. But I thought of, if it's possible, and I know teachers do a great job, and please, any teachers who are in the audience now, don't think we're having a go at you. Not at all. I've did my PGCE at Edge Hill University. I know how hard it is to be a teacher. We're just trying to give you some extra tips and guidance as to how you can perhaps improve the way that you're supporting your dyslexic kids at the moment. But if you could capture some successful interaction with a dyslexic child in the classroom, and then send either by mobile phone, take a picture of the work that they've done, do a short video clip, and then send it to the parent, the parent's going to, or the carer, they're going to feel really positive about their child who's attending the school, and they're going to feel really positive about the school who's going to the extra effort to capture that positive reflection on the work that's being done by their child. It's tricky engaging with parents of dyslexic children. Dyslexia, as we know, comes with lots of negative imagery and stereotypes and prejudice. But the sooner we can start to pop those bubbles, the more effective the relationship that we'll have with those parents and carers, and the more effective the chances of a more effective educational experience for the young person will be enhanced.
Okay, brilliant, lovely, thank you. And I think we probably can't leave talking about dyslexia without focusing on reading specifically for one part. So I don't know if any of the panel really want to answer anything about this. Just how can we help pupils here? You know, reading is a difficulty that's definitely apparent for dyslexic pupils and other pupils struggling with literacy. So, Rosie, do you want to talk a little bit about reading, or Joe, or anybody?
Shall I start off, Joe?
Yeah, go on. Yeah.
I think with reading, and I think again, it's sort of one of the themes that we've been talking about here is really understanding and breaking it down. We use, whenever we do training, the Hollis-Scarborough-Rote model, which I know lots of you have seen, and it's in the Education Endowment Fund. But one of the things that we really like, and it's been developed a bit further by a professor in America, but one of the things that it really clearly splits reading into those two parts: word reading and comprehension. And it's not just comprehension as in reading comprehension, it's language comprehension as well. And I think, like Joe said, about really understanding what your assessment's telling you. So really, what does your assessment tell you about their word reading? And when we talk about word reading, it breaks it down into decoding, but it also breaks it down into phonemic awareness, word recognition. It's just, that's one part of 3 strands. And I think sometimes what can happen, we go in heavily on one strand without looking at the other 2, or also supporting children with areas that actually that might be a strength of theirs, and that's not where they need support, they need it in the other. And even if you're thinking about language comprehension, you know, for lots of children with dyslexia, and Roger will pick me up if I'm wrong, but actually probably your oral language or your spoken language and your listening comprehension is probably quite high, but it's translating it into that reading comprehension. And sometimes there's also a continuum of that as well. So, you know, we talked about breaking down of instructions. In listening comprehension, I can say to my class, go and get your book bag, put your letter in it, get your coat, then come back and sit on the carpet. You might have 15 of your children all doing that, and you'll have 5 that have kind of got to the bit where they've got their coat, and then you've probably got another 5 who are like still standing on the carpet going, well, like, I just heard stand up. And actually it's really making sure if our listening comprehension skills aren't in place, then actually that challenges our reading comprehension as well, and making sure that we understand that. But I think going to that model and really breaking it down can help. Joe, what were you going to add to it?
Yeah, I think for a lot of dyslexic children, and we do have to remember here that every dyslexic child, every child is different, and we can't just group all dyslexic children together. And we've said a lot about finding out individually their needs, but for a lot of dyslexic children, they have good language comprehension, and if they hear a story read to them, they will understand it and they'll be able to answer questions on it. But it still may be, if we come back to that difficulty with actually reading the words on the page, that's, you know, how can we support them there? And I think, again, it will come down to, there are those 2 strands to reading. Some dyslexic pupils may need some really intensive support with phonics for reading, but they also need, and we know that those 2 distinct parts of reading need to be taught separately but used together. So they may need some separate phonics teaching, but they need to have some opportunities to use their phonics skills in enjoyable situations. So not just reading those phonically decodable books, but they need to be able to use their phonics skills to read books that interest them, and they need that to be able to do that in a nice, safe environment. So yeah, choosing books that they're able to access and read and are of interest to them, and you can choose those books from, there are several publishers. I know we've got a book that we're going to give away online from Shine Books that produce some dyslexia friendly books, and Barrington Stoke have given us some resources for teachers, but they produce books that are levelled at pupils' interest but also easy for them to read in terms of the words on the page, and that they just really get to pupils interested in reading to realise they can read, because at some point they will have found it, or they're finding it difficult, and you're not going to want to do something that's difficult. We need to make it an enjoyable experience for them.
Brilliant.
Rosie,
Roger,
there were
is there
some
any
questions about the EF on there as well. Sorry,
Yes.
is that on the Slido? Yeah, go on.
Yeah, so I think actually just to pick up on that, we're going to send out follow-up resources afterwards with a few links. One to Roger's page about the empowerment passport, which lots of people are interested in, Roger, and also for we can put some links in there for the Education Endowment Fund, which is just their 3 reports, which is improving literacy at early years, Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2, and Key Stage 3, 4 reports. And in there, they look very specifically at the different areas of literacy. And I do think the Hollis-Scarborough-Rote model, which is what I was referring to, is a really useful piece of work around reading and the complexities of reading as well. And I think, and I was just going to say, Joe, you picked up on something which I think is really important about that, building around phonics. And I think sometimes in some phonics schemes, they're absolutely brilliant because they're structured, they're synthetic, everything's there, the resources are there, the sounds match the books that they're reading. But actually, for some of those children, their phonemic awareness or other ways of accessing those phonics and those sounds are really important. And I think when Kathleen said about flexibility in a model, sometimes those one size fits all approaches need to be adapted to support them. I don't know, Roger, if there's anything you wanted to add about reading and dyslexia for that, and then we can check on the Slido as well.
Rosie, some excellent points. That flexibility and the way that one size doesn't fit all. We've got to bear in mind as well that the dyslexic individual has a notoriously poor working memory. So you might have covered a certain sound, TH sound, last week. That child might forget. So don't assume that they're going to retain the phonetic knowledge that you're trying to impart on a regular basis. It's like, Kathleen, you were saying before, it's going back to recapping constantly. And Joanne, you were kind of intimating about blending constantly, using past learning and then bringing it into the learning today, as well as introducing new ideas and concepts. But yeah, Rosie, in a nutshell, there's no magic wand to this. It's just constant effort and constant work.
And someone asked in the chat just said about reading aloud, and I know from talking to dyslexic children that is an area they really struggle with, and it's sort of worst time of their week being, there we go, Roger, of just being picked on to read. So I think it's something we just have to be aware of. I saw a really good practice in school recently where they really did talk to dyslexic children and found out what were the trigger points in the week, what were the barriers, what were the bits that they really didn't like, and what were the bits they absolutely loved. And I think that's really important in just being able to sort of be, and that's what I said about being adaptive. I think sometimes we have to tick boxes and we have to say, oh, we've got this amount of two written things in a week in our books or whatever, but are we really starting with the child and planning from that child's needs rather than looking at everything else that needs to be covered? Roger, do you want to come in on that? Or
yeah, just to give you the science behind it, there's a recent piece of research out of São Paulo University, Brazil. Fabio, it's a brilliant piece, and it just explains why dyslexic individuals are hopeless at reading out loud. We don't process the information quickly enough, effectively enough, to be able to pronounce the syllables well without making a fool of ourselves. I interviewed an MP in Parliament, dyslexic MP in Parliament, who said that was the most horrendous experience of his school life, when the English teacher used to make him stand up and read out Shakespeare in front of the class, and she'd be in floods of tears at the front of the class. We're not good at it. Don't make us do it.
I think, sorry, Kathleen, I was going to build on that point as well. I think it's one of those things that's quite interesting, because actually, if you think as a skilled reader, and I would count myself as a skilled reader, reading something the first time out loud, you have to have so many different support in place for that. And actually, what we often do, if we ask children to read aloud, we as the adult or the teacher has probably read it, knows which bits it is, knows how it all works together. The child encountering that for the first time to read aloud and put all the intonation in and process the print, for not only processing the print for the words, but processing the print for the meaning. That is a huge challenge. And I would say, actually, and we've got a question in the chat about EAL, and I think that's one of the things as well, is that actually hearing good models of language and hearing, we talk a lot in both, and Joe, I know in Lit as well, but in daily supported reading and destination reading, which are the reading approaches that Kathleen and I work on, we talk a lot about how we would read the text to the child or read it in DSR. We read the story first, so they hear how the language structures match the print on the page. So they've got that model of language inside already before they attempt to read it independently. And I think that's a really good strategy. And rereading, there's nothing wrong with rereading. Rereading is brilliant. And actually going back and reading something again, you're looking for different meanings, you're processing it. Like Roger said, you've gone through the kind of mechanical, that's how the words sound. Now I'm thinking, what are they communicating as well? Sorry, you got me onto a soapbox.
I think
Rosie, there was another. Go on, Joe.
I just think it's important to always think about why you're asking children to do these things. What are you trying to benefit from asking certain children to read things out loud? If it's because you are thinking of it's giving them practice. Is that for your dyslexic learner or lots of learners, is that the best situation to do it in front of the class? You know, it would be best for you to sit one-to-one listening to them read. And if it is, as you said, Rosie, to be a model of reading, again, is that first unrehearsed model of reading going to be the best? Yeah, thanks.
There was a question as well about, are there specific strategies, examples you give us of breaking down reading or answering questions in secondary school? I think it's what I know we do a lot in Destination Reader and in the LIT program about actually we teach it, we model it, we break it right down, and it helps the teachers and it helps the children as well. And they're aware of the sort of metacognition and they're aware of the process that they're going through when they're answering those questions. So I think see it as a specific skill that is quite separate to reading itself is quite useful. Okay, how are we doing on the questions? I think we've probably covered. We're coming to the end. Do you think, in terms of, are there any other questions?
There was just that really nice one I liked on there from Jason about, does anyone embed awareness and understanding of dyslexia in a whole class setting rather than just for those who are dyslexic? Does it create empathy? And I think we probably have covered that, haven't we? But it might be a nice thing to end on, to say that hopefully from what everybody's heard today is, yes, do share it as a whole school, a whole class, understanding that if other pupils in the class are aware of the difficulties and differences and the strengths of dyslexic learners or everyone in the class, and why things might be certainly, you know, different or done in a different way for certain pupils, of course it's going to, build up the self-esteem for that pupil, but yeah, build empathy in the class, I hope. Yeah.
I think sharing that information is really important with
Yeah.
other pupils. I think that absolutely it's about building empathy. I think that's a great
Yeah.
idea, Jo.
Yeah.
And actually, Kathleen, somebody put in the chat as well about whole school family approach and what advice how do you have to improve parents and carers and knowledge? And I would say actually all those things about sharing, that making sure that that information goes back home, and on the fact sheet that we've got, or the sort of support sheet that we've got as a handout, we talked a lot about thinking about how you communicate with parents who could have dyslexia themselves. So thinking about the information you send home, are letters really long? Is the font too small? All those things that we know would support them, but also really making sure that parents know where they can go to get support, and that there are good places to do it as well. So I think that, and actually that it's not uncommon, and like Roger said, it's a lifelong problem that you will manage, but it shouldn't ever hold you back. Roger, should we leave you as the end person to sum us all up?
Okay, thank you, Rosie. Thanks to everybody involved, Mario, Joanne, Kathleen, Rosie, and Joe behind the scenes, and Simon. You know, what a great effort this webinar's been by this team from Hackney Borough Council. I can't speak highly enough of them. I wish every local authority had the same approach. But that last point, Joanne, that you raised, that Jason made the point about having this healthy school environment. People are different, you know, we're all unique. Not two of us are the same. Even twins are not identical, you know, they're different in different ways. We should embrace that, you know, and try and get schools to embrace that and encourage pupils to be tolerant of each other's difference and understanding of each other's differences. And then we can move forward. It makes it a much better community, doesn't it? Move forward more positively. And I think we should leave it on that positive note.
Do you know what we have? And I've just got another question that comes through the Slido, which actually I realised I meant to cover, which is just about dyslexic children and diagnosis. And I think really it's the best thing to do is to go to your local education authority. And I think we had some people saying, and this is what I don't know actually, Roger and Joe, but can you only get a dyslexic diagnosis through a private medical one, or is it just very dependent on your area? I'm not leaving it on a positive note, I'm leaving it on a can of worms.
Yeah. Well, I could say, you know, it's not you talked about a medical one, but it's, you know, educational psychologists can do them. I trained as a dyslexic assessor, so there will be a range of people that can, but the difficulty is accessing those diagnoses, and it will either become that parents will feel that they need to pay for that privately, or it will depend on your local authority. And as you say, Rosie, that will be different from each authority to the next. I don't know if there's anything you had to add to that, Roger, in your experience.
Yeah, I think I'm finding that local authorities differ massively across the country in their approach to dyslexia. There are some, like your own, obviously very positive on the front foot and trying to be as supportive as possible. There are others that wish it just the word never existed. I won't name names because it's unfair. They can't respond. But you've got about, don't forget, you can ask your GP for an assessment. They do have access to pots of funding for it, not much, but if you press the case regarding medical health of the individual, etc., you can have success. What we ideally want is the SEND code to have a real simple process of referring it to a local authority designated educational psychologist who will then perform the assessment on that individual. That's the ideal scenario. However, we're living in 2022 when we know that austerity measures across the country, across local authorities are really biting now. So, we've just got to be hopeful that the local authority that particular individual is going to be in is going to be able to respond.
That's really useful, Roger. Thanks.
Okay, let's leave it there.
Yeah.
Thank you ever so much for joining, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much to Roger as well.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you all.
Take care,
Bye.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.